So I just want to make a comment in that Zen, which is known as Chan in China, is primarily a monastic community in where laymen would build the temples and the grounds and care for them, and then contribute to these schools for their family members to go to. Because I want to make it very clear that in the old world, and we're going to say from about 1850 to the distant past, literacy was not required to function. Most of the population was illiterate, about 95% of the population. If you were lucky with fortunate rebirth into a family of royalty, nobility, or of wealth, merchants or civil service, then you were probably lucky enough to be educated either in a secular or religious school. And this even is true in the West, where up and until recent times, most of the world was illiterate, and the only way that you got to learn anything was through schooling, and the majority of the schools were religious. In the West, you would go become you would go to a monastery to learn to read and write. The larger cities had secular schools, which you had to pay for those. And if your family was a patronage of a church and who had donated greatly to the church, they would then take your children in and teach them how to read and write. So this was pretty much how it was within China and Japan, that if you wanted to learn to read and write and you were not fortunate to have a good birth, let's say you were born as a son to a peasant farmer, then it was up to you to get yourself either into a monastery, or the family had been, very blessed and was big patrons of the family, or you had a relative that was already in the monastery. And the families would pay, the families would donate and give to these monasteries because they knew that was the only way that their children were going to get any education. Of course, monasteries, like in the old days, even secular schools or colleges, they would separate the sexes. Boys would go to boys' schools, girls would go to the girls' schools. Women were not really taught much more than what we consider an 8th grade education. Even in the old world, women were not taught the sciences and the philosophies. It's not to say that they couldn't understand and discuss at that level. It was just that they were not taught. The same thing within the Asian cultures. Women were not educated. Other than just functional education, it was even very uncommon to find a woman who can read. Many women taught themselves how to read. And many women, even into the Western cultures, would teach themselves how to read and read all the books of the great thinkers outside of the colleges. Outside. It was considered heretical for women to read. So in Buddhism, if you were a woman of a royal family or of the aristocracy or merchant class, you were going to learn, they would teach you how to read and write, but only to a functional point. The boys, they were taught how to read the sutras, how to understand things, and how to think about things. But that was it. I think they call it parochial education now, when it's in the religious auspices. And even today, you go to a religious school, you have to sign a piece of paper that states that you will uphold their religious beliefs and their tenets. And if you are found that you are saying things against their religious beliefs and tenets, they ask you to leave. That's it. If your behavior and your actions embarrass the school, you're asked to leave. I just wanted to point out that monasticism in the Buddhist world was where the education happened, and families knew that if they wanted their sons to be anything more than a common laborer, they needed to learn to read and write. When Buddhism came to the West, it was already coming to a population that was already literate. But yet, we had a different issue. We were coming through a culture that had one of the biggest cults ever thrusted upon us that few people talk about. Now, the cult that I'm talking about started about in the mid-17th century, fully developed or kind of became known in the 18th century, and that is the purity cults. Now, in the 18th century, it was a belief with the Christians that the women, and this was only for women, had to be pure. And this would mean that women would have no sex. They would be virgins on the day of their wedding, and they would not even know man. So they not only were they had never had a child, but they have never had intercourse. And this was considered purity. And thus the young women were instructed in such a way to not incite men or to not attract men to them for their beauty, for their to encourage the lust in men. And thus women would not wear makeup, would put a scarf over their hair. In a sense, they were to dress in such a way that would not expose themselves in any way. So that was the customs of the long sleeve shirts and the dresses down to the feet, to not expose the skin, to even at times to cover the face even. You also see this purity culture play out in Islam, and that the women are not to be out there to excite men, that they are to be virginal and celibate until the day of their marriage. This was a belief that was created from Christian theologians around the 18th century, and they try to claim it was from Paul, but it doesn't work. They try to say, well, Jesus taught this, and Jesus never taught this, and they try to say, well, it's in the Bible, and actually it's not in the Bible. The Bible actually doesn't teach anything close to purity culture. I mean, when you have, fathers raping their daughters and daughters getting their fathers drunk to have sex with them, and men with multiple wives, and owning sex slaves, and there's homosexuality in the Bible, believe it or not, and they call them beloved. When a man calls another man beloved, it's a homosexual lover. So now we have no doctrinal basis within the Western Christianity for purity culture. Where does it come from? Again, if it's not doctrinal and it's not found within the 66 books of composes of the Bible, then it's made up. It comes from those who are trying to create a cult. And cults are big things because cults are power. The fastest and the biggest way to create a cult is to control the sexuality of the faithful, the congregants, those that are believing your message. If you tell the people, oh, you have to be celibate to be married, and if you can't divorce, otherwise you're committing adultery, you can't remarry. That's a big thing, and if a person can control the congregant's sexual life, then they control all aspects of that person's life, and thus they become a full-blown cult. Check all the boxes. It's a high control cult. And that is what happened with Christianity coming out of the 17th century. And you saw this. I remember growing up and running into, the Lutherans, the Methodists, the Catholics, all of them had this purity cult aspect that they dragged into it, that was coming from these evil theologians, these evil ministers, these evil pastors, these evil priests, who were just reciting it because that's what they were taught. That is what they were drug into. That is what was pushed onto them by other evil men, all in the name of preserving this cult that was founded upon what? Upon sex. Because guess who gets all the sex in these cults? That's right, the ministers, the preachers, and the evil pastors. Even today, that's what we see. It's like, oh, well, if you have sex with the preacher or the minister or the pastor, oh, then it's okay. And it doesn't count. But if you have sex with that boy over there that you like, oh, you can't do that. That is what was going on in early Christianity. And we saw a resurgence of this in the 1990s with the Jonas Brothers and the purity rings. So suddenly, purity culture wasn't just for women, it was for men and women. The boys had to make pledges to be pure as well. And thus, no sex before marriage, not even to masturbate. Let's get into, to avoid anything that could incite any sort of sexual feelings. Oh, I can't listen to rock and roll, have to dress, modestly, conservatively, can't be next to a woman, have to have separation. And again, it's very interesting, purity culture. Or the purity cult. And it was fascinating to watch that regeneration of how that spun up. And how everybody once again was, oh, we got to wear scarves over the women, wearing scarves over their head, and dressing in very drab and wearing the long dresses to cover their bodies. Very interesting. It was like, well, why don't we just wear burqas and be done with it? And some women actually were considering that is where they should go. Is young women should wear burqas until they're married. So now, this is the biggest cult in the United States. This cult traveled eastward as Christians, namely Jesuits and other Christians, went into the Far East. It was sort of adopted a little bit by the Buddhist culture, started infusing the purity cult within their own religious circles, in where women were going to be pure for their husbands. Jesus was thought of as a bodhisattva, if he's, or the god of the Westerners, so they sort of figured, well, if that's what Jesus teaches, then sounds Jesus, they said that's fine, and we can pick that up too. If it makes the Westerners happy that we're not heathen sluts, then, because at the time Westerners were bringing technology and riches and modernization to a people that never knew it. It was literally as if gods were walking upon the earth to the Asian people, who also wanted modernization, industrialization, to liberate themselves from the drudgery of Aquarian life, that of farming and livestock raising, to actually be able to make things and to build things more than just a mud hut. So now purity culture starts to enter into Buddhism around the 18th, 19th century, mostly 19th century. And we see a little bit of this coming through the when the East meets West collision, and especially when the Jesuit ships and the trading ships were going into China and coming out. We saw this with the Dutch bringing it into China. We saw this with the French in Vietnam and Korea. We saw this with the English and Americans in Japan. So now purity culture invades Buddhism in the modern sense, in where men and women are taught, well, now you have to be pure. So come to the modern times, we see purity culture still very much, or the purity cults very much pervading into modern day Buddhism, where a lot of men and women still believe that they have to live pure lives in order to reach enlightenment or in order to be holy. And yet you could ask them, well, where does this come from? And they can't answer you because they don't know. They will just say, well, it's just Buddhism. And say, well, where? What sutra? Where exactly are you getting this from? And they will say, well, it's the teaching of so-and-so, which they're going to be referring to some current teacher or some current 20th century person who is just regurgitating purity cult because it was pressed onto themselves. But when you say, well, where exactly in the Mahayana Sutras or in the core of the scriptures, and we're including Chinese and Japanese Zen masters, and maybe even going into the Indian sources, where does it say this? It doesn't say it. That is where it all kind of falls apart, is that Westerners are still caught in this cult of purity. We are still mesmerized and in fear that somehow, if we don't live pure lives, that we're out. We're going to go to hell. We're going to burn forever. That we'll be damned. That we will not make it to the promised land. And I try to tell you, this is all cult. This is the biggest cult in the world. It is the biggest source of frustration and suffering that I have ever seen. It's one of these things where it's like, wow, when you start to really see how this purity culture, this purity cult, creates suffering, it creates hardships, it creates nothing but envy and hate. And you start to realize that it has no support. It is not in the Christian Bible as people try to say it is. It's not in the Old Testament. It's not in the New Testament. It's not in the sutras. It's not in the suttas. It's not in any of the Zen master teachings. Where does it come from? It comes from evil monks, evil priests, evil pastors, and evil ministers who only use this to create cults of power for themselves. And in thus, I urge you to reject this, to reject those people that preach these things, and to reject those teachings. I know it's hard because we're so brought up into this. It's like, wow, it's even kind of entered into secular life. I mean, I know people, I used to do wedding videos, and They were secular weddings, but they were still kind of holding to the purity culture of being faithful to my husband, and it's all purity culture. And you're like, wow, this is a very, very, this is the world's largest cult, the one that nobody talks about. And if you can't talk about it, it means it's still going on. It's still taboo because you can't talk about it. Just like there's certain other things we can't talk about. Because if you talk about it, it's taboo. It's the truth. It's like Tucker said. Whatever it is that you can't talk about, well, that's the truth. So I ask you to look into this for yourself, to look into what you were taught, to look into all the little rules and all the little things that you were told, even as a small child, of what you can and can't do. And ask yourself, where did it come from? For whose benefit are these things done for? What is the source? If they told me it's from the Bible, where in the Bible? If they told me it was a teaching of Buddha, where in the Buddha? Because remember, evil people lie. They say things that were not taught. People say things about Jesus that Jesus never said. People say things about the Bible that are not in the Bible. People will claim that Buddha said this or Buddha said that he never said. Or people will claim it's a Buddhist teaching, but it cannot be upheld. There's no source for that teaching. The only thing that I can say is that when this is found out, when you find that you have been led by evil people, evil preachers and evil monks, there's only one thing you can do, which is to disassociate from them and disassociate from what they taught. It's one thing to say, okay, I don't follow that guy no more. But you also have to drop what they taught. A lot of these people use fear. They use fear of damnation. They use fear of missing out. They use fear that you're not going to go to the promised land. They use fear as their control. And when it's like that, that's the biggest checkbox on the cult list you can find. When somebody is throwing fear at you, oh, if you don't obey, you're going to die. Oh, where have we heard this one before? Like a couple of years ago? If you don't obey, you're going to kill Grandma. That's right, Grandma's going to die because you don't obey. Yeah, that is how evil works. Anyhow, my friends, this is just a little note for you all to think about. Something for you to ponder and find out for yourself if it's true. Don't just believe me because I said it.